Episode 61, titled Kerberos Concepts for the Exam, the goal is to explain Kerberos basics so identity scenarios feel understandable instead of mysterious. Kerberos shows up in questions because it sits at the intersection of authentication, trust, and lateral movement, and exam scenarios often describe symptoms rather than giving you a tidy label. When you understand the core idea, you can interpret those symptoms and make better choices about what is happening and what the safest next step should be. This is not about memorizing every message type or field. It is about having a working mental model you can apply under time pressure. Kerberos is one of those topics where a small amount of clarity pays off repeatedly across multiple domains. By the end, you should be able to read a scenario, recognize the ticket-based pattern, and explain it in plain language without getting lost in jargon. Kerberos is best described as ticket-based authentication for trusted network environments, where users and services rely on a shared authority to prove identity. Instead of sending a password to every service, the user authenticates to a trusted central system and receives proof that can be presented to services. The environment is trusted in the sense that the participating systems agree on the central authority and share the necessary trust relationships to accept its claims. That trust is why Kerberos is common in enterprise networks, because it supports single sign-on and reduces the need for repeated credential entry. The security promise is that services can verify identity without ever needing to handle the user's password directly on every request. The practical takeaway is that Kerberos shifts the problem from send passwords everywhere to protect the ticket system and its trust. Tickets are the heart of the model, and the easiest way to think about them is as temporary proof that replaces repeated passwords. Once a user has authenticated to the central authority, they can obtain tickets that represent their right to access specific services. Those tickets have lifetimes and are meant to be used for a limited period, which reduces the risk of constant password exposure and supports smooth user experience. A ticket is not the user's password, and the user does not hand their password to every service. Instead, they present a ticket that the service can verify. This reduces the number of times a password is handled and reduces the opportunities for password interception during normal service access. On the exam, if you see a scenario where a user authenticates once and then accesses multiple internal services seamlessly, you are often looking at ticket-based behavior. The idea of tickets also helps you understand why Kerberos is attractive and why it creates unique risks. A ticket is like a short-lived credential that proves identity and sometimes privilege, and it is accepted by services because it was issued by a trusted authority. This means the network can operate efficiently because services can trust a standardized proof rather than running their own password checks. It also means that if an attacker obtains ticket material or can influence ticket issuance, they may gain access without needing to guess passwords repeatedly. Tickets are designed to be reused within their valid lifetime, which is a feature for users but an opportunity for attackers. The exam angle is that tickets represent access, and access can be moved if the environment allows it. So you need to understand how proof of identity can become proof of privilege in the wrong hands. Once you internalize that, many attack scenarios stop sounding like magic. Kerberos has key roles that can be described simply as the client, the service, and a central ticket authority that issues and validates the proof. The client is the user or system that wants access, such as a workstation acting on behalf of a user. The service is the target resource, such as a file server, application server, or other network service that requires authentication. The central ticket authority is the trusted system that vouches for identity and issues tickets, and it is the anchor of trust for the environment. The important part is not memorizing formal names, but understanding the relationship. The client asks the authority for a ticket, then presents that ticket to the service, and the service accepts it because it trusts the authority. This trust chain is what makes single sign-on possible, and it is also what makes authority compromise or misuse high impact. On the exam, you can often identify these roles in a scenario by asking who is requesting access, who is granting access, and who is vouching for the identity. Time matters in Kerberos because clocks and expirations influence ticket validity, and this shows up in both operational issues and security reasoning. Tickets are intended to be valid for a defined window, and systems rely on time checks to determine whether a ticket is still acceptable.
If clocks are out of sync, tickets may be rejected even when the user's credentials are correct, which is why time synchronization is operationally important in these environments.
From a security perspective, time limits reduce the window in which a stolen ticket is useful, but they do not eliminate risk, because attackers can still exploit tickets within that window. Expiration also shapes attacker behavior, because ticket reuse and renewal policies influence how long access can persist without reauthentication. On exam scenarios, time-related errors, authentication failures that come and go, or sudden access issues after clock changes can be clues that Kerberos timing is involved. A good mental model treats time as part of the trust system, not as a background detail. Common weakness themes around Kerberos tend to cluster around delegated trust, misconfigurations, and credential theft, and these themes matter because they drive lateral movement. Delegated trust can allow systems or services to act on behalf of users in broader ways than intended, which can create paths where one compromised service becomes a stepping stone to others. Misconfigurations can weaken the intended boundaries, such as overly broad permissions, weak controls around service accounts, or trust relationships that allow unintended behavior across systems. Credential theft matters because if an attacker can obtain secrets tied to accounts that request or validate tickets, they can often request access in ways that look legitimate. These weaknesses are rarely about breaking Kerberos as a protocol, and more about abusing how the environment uses Kerberos to express trust and privilege. On the exam, look for cues about over-permissioned accounts, misscoped delegation, and unexpected access across services, because those are common anchors for Kerberos-related questions. When you tie the weakness to trust and privilege, your interpretation will usually be closer to the intended answer. Ticket misuse enables lateral movement without new password guessing, because tickets allow access to services once they are obtained, and attackers aim to reuse that access rather than repeatedly guess credentials. If an attacker can obtain valid ticket material, they can present it to multiple services as long as the trust relationship's accepted and the ticket remains valid. This means the attacker's activity can look like normal authenticated access, which reduces the need for noisy password guessing attempts and can complicate detection. The lateral movement pattern is often obtain an initial foothold, obtain or reuse ticket-based proof, then access additional services that trust that proof. This is why identity is such a high-value target in enterprise networks. Authentication systems are designed to make access easier for legitimate users, and attackers want to exploit that same convenience. For exam purposes, recognize that no password guessing does not mean no credential abuse, because ticket reuse is a form of credential abuse. When you see access spreading across services after one successful authentication event, tickets should be on your mental shortlist. Now, consider a scenario where a ticket grants access across multiple services because it illustrates the core concept cleanly. Imagine a user logs into a workstation and then accesses a file share, a database service, and an internal web application without entering their password again. Later, you see that the same access pattern occurs from a different host context after a compromise, where the attacker appears to access multiple internal services without triggering repeated password prompts. The clue is the seamless access across services, which suggests that once proof was obtained, it was accepted repeatedly by multiple services. This is exactly the kind of scenario where ticket-based authentication becomes an enabler of movement, because access is not negotiated from scratch every time. The defender's challenge is that the activity can look like legitimate single sign-on behavior, especially if the attacker is using valid proof material rather than guessing passwords. The exam angle is to recognize the mechanism and then reason about what should be protected and monitored to reduce that risk.
Safe reasoning steps in a Kerberos scenario start with identifying the privilege level, scope, and the next action you would take in a controlled, defensible way. Privilege level asks whose access is being represented, such as a normal user versus an administrator or a service account, because privilege determines impact. Scope asks what services and systems accept the proof and how broadly it can be reused, because that determines blast radius. Next action asks what the safest step is to increase certainty without disruption, such as reviewing authentication logs for unusual ticket usage patterns, confirming which accounts are involved, and identifying whether delegation or trust configuration is broader than intended. You also consider time and validity windows, because sudden failures or short-lived access can signal ticket expiration dynamics. In a testing context, the safest action is often to confirm the trust relationships and privileges that make the access possible, rather than trying to escalate activity simply because you can. This reasoning produces a cleaner conclusion and a cleaner remediation path.
A common pitfall is confusing tickets with tokens from web applications, because both represent proof and both can be reused, but they exist in different contexts and have different trust models. Web application tokens are typically issued by the application or an identity provider for web sessions, while Kerberos tickets are part of a network authentication system designed for trusted enterprise environments.
If you treat them as interchangeable, you can misinterpret scenario clues, especially when the question is really about enterprise authentication and lateral movement, rather than web session handling.
Another pitfall is assuming tickets are inherently secure simply because they are not passwords, ignoring that they still represent access and can be abused if obtained.
It is also easy to overlook the role of service accounts and delegation, which can matter more than the user's own account in some environments.
On the exam, if you see enterprise access across file services and internal resources with single sign-on behavior, keep Kerberos separate from web session tokens in your reasoning.
Clear separation of those concepts helps you pick the correct explanation and mitigation. Quick wins in reducing Kerberos-related risk emphasize least privilege, hardening, and monitoring suspicious ticket use, because those controls reduce the impact of ticket misuse without requiring you to redesign the entire environment. Least privilege means tightening what accounts can do and limiting where high-privilege accounts are used, because broad privilege makes ticket abuse more damaging. Hardening includes restricting delegation to only what is needed, protecting service accounts, and ensuring configuration aligns with intended trust boundaries. Monitoring suspicious ticket use means watching for unusual access patterns, such as tickets being used from unexpected hosts, abnormal service access sequences, or atypical time patterns that do not match user behavior. These quick wins are practical because they align with normal identity governance practices and provide measurable improvements. They also help incident response because better visibility into ticket activity makes it easier to differentiate legitimate single sign-on from hostile movement. For exam reasoning, controls that reduce trust abuse and improve detection are typically the best choices. Reporting language for Kerberos' related findings should describe behavior, impact, and recommended controls clearly, because stakeholders may not need protocol details to understand the risk. You describe what was observed, such as access spreading across services without repeated password prompts, unusual ticket usage patterns, or trust configurations that allow broader access than intended. You describe impact in terms of lateral movement capability, such as how one compromised context can lead to access to multiple internal services without additional password guessing. You recommend controls like tightening delegation, enforcing least privilege on accounts involved, protecting high-value identities, and improving monitoring and alerting for unusual ticket usage. You also note constraints and confidence levels, especially if your validation was limited to observation and policy review rather than deeper testing. Clear reporting turns Kerberos from a buzzword into an understandable access story with concrete control improvements. The goal is actionable clarity, not protocol trivia. To keep the key points sticky for the exam, use this memory phrase: tickets, time, trust, privilege, movement. Tickets remind you that Kerberos uses temporary proof rather than repeated password submission to services. Time reminds you that validity windows and clock alignment matter for both functionality and risk boundaries. Trust reminds you that services accept tickets because they trust the central authority, which is powerful and therefore sensitive. Privilege reminds you that the impact depends on whose access the ticket represents and what that identity can do. Movement reminds you that ticket reuse can enable lateral access across services without new password guessing, which is why Kerberos appears in attack path scenarios. With that phrase, you can quickly interpret identity questions and connect them to practical mitigations. To conclude episode 61, titled Kerberos Concepts for the Exam, remember that Kerberos is a ticket-based way to prove identity inside trusted networks, designed to reduce repeated password use while enabling seamless access across services. When trust is misscoped or when ticket material is abused, attackers can move laterally without noisy password guessing, and that is why the topic matters. The safest way to reason about Kerberos scenarios is to identify who the ticket represents, what services accept it, how time affects validity, and what controls limit trust and privilege. If you can explain tickets in one plain sentence, say it like this: a Kerberos ticket is temporary proof from a trusted authority that lets a user access services without re-entering their password each time. When that sentence feels natural, Kerberos questions become less intimidating because you can map the scenario back to tickets, trust, and movement quickly.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.